The Sony ZV-E1 is one of the most powerful cameras that Sony has ever made, but it's also a pretty complicated camera. And unless you know the exact specific settings to use, you won't be able to get the best quality for your photos and videos from this camera. And without the right settings, you more than likely will not be able to make this camera work for your shooting style. So in this video, I want to give you a simple, straightforward guide on how to get the most from your ZV-1. And this guide is also set up for beginners, casuals, but also pros looking to maximize their camera. Let's get into it. All right, so let me introduce you to the ZV-E1. So this is the body, and right up here you have your record button, which is the red circle, your shutter button for photos. Up here is a zoom rocker, which is a digital zoom, and I do not recommend using it. Next to it is your defocus button, which I will explain later. It's a very cool feature on this camera. And right here in the center is your mode toggle. On the left is photos, middle is video, and on the right is slow motion and quick motion. And I will explain all of this more in depth as the video goes on. And right up here, people will probably think this is a speaker, but this is actually your microphone. And this actually has 3 microphones built right into it, and this is what's capturing your audio. Your speaker, however, are these 2 little holes right up here at the top. This is where all of your audio is going to come from. And this camera also does not have a mechanical shutter in it, so if you ever hear the shutter sound, it's actually just an audio playing right up here through this speaker. And right up here is your on and off switch. So once you have your camera on, let me show you how to control your camera. Once you go into your camera, you want to make sure your lens is actually extended if you are using the kit lens like I am. And back here is a scroll wheel for your shutter. This knob right up here is your aperture. And if you want to change ISO, simply want to hit right here and your ISO will come up. One thing I love about this camera is that everything is touch enabled. It really does feel like a smartphone. You can actually touch your shutter speed and change your shutter speed using the touch screen. And speaking of touch enabled, when you open up your camera, you'll actually see a menu right up here. All of these are menu options that you can simply tap and touch, and I'll go over what each of these menu options do. Now, these menu options do change depending on what mode you're in, if you're in photo, video, or slow motion. And another way to control your camera is also the FN button right here. Once you hit this, you'll get another quick menu here, and this will give you some of the same options, some of the different options, but this is also another way you can control your camera. All right, so let's talk about how do you get the best photo and video quality from your brand new camera. Now, this really comes down to the type of files you're shooting. So depending on if you want the best photos and videos, make sure you have your camera set to the exact mode. Let's talk about photos first. From there, you want to hit menu. Once you hit that, you'll kind of go into your home menu, which is this little white home icon. And from there, you want to scroll over using the scroll wheel on the left. It's also a button pad to JPEG. If you're someone that's shooting mainly for casual everyday use, JPEG will be just fine, but if you want to shoot the best possible quality, you want to be making sure you're shooting RAW, but this camera also gives you different options for what kind of JPEGs and what kind of RAW photos you can shoot. So once you go into JPEG, you want to pick JPEG. From there, you can pick if you want to just shoot RAW, JPEG and RAW, or just JPEG. I do not recommend shooting both because unless you need JPEGs for your clients and RAW for yourself, just shoot one. So for this purpose, we're gonna go with RAW because you're gonna get the best quality. And once we scroll over to middle RAW, which at the top you can see RAW file type, you wanna go into this and you have 3 options: uncompressed, lossless compressed, and compressed. Uncompressed basically means the full file, no compression, nothing is done to it. You're just getting the pure file. Unless you're doing professional commercial work, you really don't need this. And compressed is, it takes the file, doesn't throw away any of the data, but it makes it harder for your computer to edit those files. What I recommend most people do is go with lossless compressed. This way you're going to get the maximum quality, but it's going to compress the files just enough so that you're not eating through your SD card, but your computer is still going to be fine when it comes to editing these files. Now, if you are someone that's working on a really weak computer, I recommend shooting uncompressed. Just know that you're going to eat through your card very, very fast. And if you are someone that's shooting JPEGs only, you want to go over to JPEG quality, click into that, and you'll get extra fine, fine, or standard. Now, there is never any reason to shoot anything besides extra fine. JPEGs really don't take up that much space, and this way you know you're going to get the best JPEGs possible. And just in case you want to do some heavy editing to your JPEGs, you will have access to all of that information using extra fine mode. Never ever use standard or anything below that. Now, depending on what kind of subject matter you're shooting, if you go right down here, you'll see drive mode. Now, all these settings are up here. And once you go into drive mode, you have a bunch of options. A single shooting is just one photo and the camera stops. But with continuous shooting, you can simply hold down the shutter button and the camera will keep shooting until the camera electronics need a break. Now, for most people, like I said earlier, I recommend shooting in low, but if you're shooting something with high moving subject matter, I recommend shooting in high plus. But there's one setting that most people overlook, and this is one of the most important settings when it comes to photos. It's your focus mode. And now this camera actually has a really complicated focus mode because this camera actually has artificial intelligence based autofocus, so there's a few settings to change. All right, so from your home menu, you wanna go all the way to the bottom to focus area. Now, this is going to determine what area of your frame or what area of your sensor the autofocus is working in. Now, the first one is wide, the second one is zone, and there's different reasons to use each one. If you're using wide, this is going to have autofocus on your entire sensor, and this is what I recommend to most people. But if you're shooting something that you know is going to be in the top left, top right center of your frame, I actually recommend going into zone and picking what zone you want your autofocus working in. This is going to make it easier for the autofocus to just focus on one area, and it's going to make it more reliable and faster. Next up, let's talk about what focus mode you want to be shooting in. So for that, you want to go back into your menu here. You want to go left over to focus mode, as you can see up top. Click into it and you've got single shot, automatic, continuous, DMF, and manual focus. Now, it's really nice that Sony has given us so many options, but you really only need to focus on two, and anything else is a waste of your time. You want to pick single shot if you know your subject matter is sitting in one place, and maybe you're shooting portraits, product photography, something that's stationary. With single autofocus, it's just going to keep the autofocus in the same place, and even if you hold down your photo button, it's just going to keep the autofocus or the focus in one place. But if you know your subject is moving around a lot, you want to go with automatic autofocus. This way, it's going to figure out where it's going, what focus mode it needs to use on its own. This camera is very, very smart. Now, there is continuous autofocus, and as great as it is to have continuous autofocus, you really don't need to use that mode because it's just extra legwork for you to go between different modes. For most people, if you know your subject matter is moving, I recommend going with auto. There's also DMF and manual focus. You really don't need this because these are manual modes, and if you're gonna spend thousands on a fancy camera, why would you ever use manual focus? In some cases, you might want to if you're focusing on something very, very specific and the camera's not working, but for most people, you really won't need it. And the last setting that you need to know for autofocus is subject tracking. If you go into your main menu, right here is your touch menu. If you don't see a touch menu, you can also hit FN and you'll see this little recognition target right here. So you wanna click into that and you'll see a human, animal, bird, cat, animal, all these things. This allows your camera to understand what you're trying to focus on. If you're shooting just animals, it will ignore all of the humans and it will just focus on the animals. If you're just trying to shoot humans, it will ignore the animals. And if you're just trying to shoot trains and airplanes, guess what? It'll just focus on the vehicles, ignore the people. This is a really, really important setting to pick for your camera because if you're shooting in a crowded environment, this is going to help your camera to use autofocus better, and it's also going to make your autofocus faster and more reliable. So if you don't use any of the other settings I talked to you about, you want to make sure you use subject detection or recognition so your camera knows exactly what you're trying to focus on. And all of these settings that I just showed you for autofocus also work for video, so now you know both. Now, video is why you probably bought this camera, but video has a ton of complicated settings, and it takes a lot more work to set this thing up for video in the right way, depending on what you're shooting. So let's dive into the video settings and set this up for different use cases. So the first thing you wanna do is you wanna set the mode dial to video, and next up, you wanna go back into your menu, and you'll notice you now have two home menus that do wildly different things. So let's go through the first one. The first thing you can do is change your frame rate. Now, your frame rate will depend on the type of content you're shooting. If you're doing a sit-down talking head video, kind of like this, you're talking to people, you can actually choose 24 or 30. Now, for most TV and YouTube, I recommend shooting at 30 frames per second. Most of the big YouTubers shoot at 30. It makes your video look smoother, but if you want to shoot something a little more cinematic, a little more artsy, 24 is generally accepted as the cinematic and the artsy frame rate. But Most people don't know a difference or don't see a difference unless they're really into video. So this will really depend on what you want. 60 frames per second is interesting because 60 frames per second has two very distinct uses. One, 60 frames per second is usually used for sports, wildlife, something with a lot of action, something where you want the audience to feel like they're right there in the action. 60 frames per second is going to give you more information because it's going to shoot more frames per second and it's going to give you smoother motion in your video. The second reason you want to use 60 frames per second is for slow motion. When you're editing your video, you can simply slow down your video by 50 or 60% and you will actually get 2 times slow motion with this video. And now we will talk about slow motion and how to get the best results for slow motion later in this section, but I just want you guys to know that this camera will shoot anywhere between 24 to 60 frames per second. Now, one of the most overlooked settings for getting the best possible video quality is ISO. Most people shoot at whatever ISO they want, so they're just like, yeah, it makes my image brighter. But the truth is, when it comes to video, ISO is very critical, and to get the best results, you have to shoot on very specific ISOs, also known as native ISOs or base ISOs. So let's go into the ISO here, and you'll see a whole bunch of ISOs, and this camera can shoot at a really high ISO, as high as 400,000, 200,000, like it is bonkers. But you'll also notice that some of the ISOs have a line underneath them. So when you see a line on the ISO, what that means is this is not a native ISO. And shooting on those ISOs will give you not the best results. So that also means if you shoot at an ISO too low or too high, your camera will give you grainy or staticky image. So with Sony ZV-E1 and the A7S III, the FX3, because the sensor is the same, generally the best ISOs to shoot at is 640 and 12,800. 640 is probably what most people should be shooting at if they're shooting talking head stuff like this, stuff outdoors. But if you're shooting low light stuff, it's best to shoot at 12,800 ISO. And one thing to note is if you're shooting outside and you're okay with just 8,000 ISO, it's actually better to bump up your ISO to 12,800 ISO because you will get better dynamic range, better quality overall by shooting at 12,800 ISO rather than just 8,000 ISO. So you want to make sure you're either just on the native ISO of 640 or 12,800 ISO, and you want to make sure if you're close to it, just go down to that native ISO and compensate with your aperture and shutter speed. Hope that made sense. Now, the best way to make sure that you're getting the most amount of data and the highest resolution from your camera is by scrolling over to right here. You'll see file format at the top, go into this, and there's a ton of options here. They're pretty confusing. So I'm gonna try to keep it as simple as possible. If you go all the way down to XAVC SI-HD, you will be able to shoot at the highest quality. And if you want to shoot 4K, you want to go over to XAVC SI 4K. Wow, that is a mouthful. And that will give you the highest quality. But I do not recommend shooting on this mode basically, unless you're planning on shooting something like a short film, a commercial, and you want to make sure you get the most out of this camera, because in that mode, it is going to eat up your battery way faster. It's going to burn through your card, and the camera will also start to get hotter. Now, here's the thing with overheating on this camera. I have personally not been able to get this camera to overheat, but I also live in Canada where it is freezing cold all the time. If you live in Arizona, LA, New York, where you guys actually see the sun, that glowing thing in the sky, your camera will without a doubt overheat in this mode. So when you're shooting in this mode, you also have to keep in mind that you are going to need to take breaks and you won't be able to shoot for more than 10-15 minutes. And if that's something that's not a problem for you, feel free to shoot in this mode because it will give you the best possible image quality. But if you're like me and you do a lot of talking head stuff and you don't want to deal with overheating, you actually want to pick XAVC-S 4K. And right above that is XAVC-HS 4K. Now these are slightly different modes, and depending on what you're shooting, it'll be a little bit different. If you're editing your videos on a Mac with a brand new Apple Silicon, you will probably have a very easy time shooting on XAVC-HS 4K. This is a compressed format, but it's also a brand new file format that works best on Apple Silicon. But if you're a peasant like me, you're editing on a PC, I recommend shooting on XAVC-S 4K. You shouldn't see too much of a quality difference, but you will see a difference in the type of videos you can record, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Once you have your mode selected and you go into record settings, you will have a bunch of different options here. If you're shooting in XAVC-S, which is the standard mode, you will only have choices between 200 megabits 422 10-bit, which refers to the amount of colors this video file has. 200 megabits is a lot, or 150 megabits 420 8-bit. And I never, ever, ever want to see anybody shooting in 8-bit. It is too late in the game to shoot in 8-bit. This camera costs a lot of money. You should always shoot in 10-bit, but you will only be able to shoot in 200 megabits per second in 10-bit. The advantage of shooting in XAVC HS4K is that once you pick that, you have way more options of 10-bit footage. This way you can also shoot 10-bit at 45 megabits per second, so you'll save a bunch of information in terms of hard drive space and card space, but you'll still get 10-bit color. And this is going to be really useful for someone that's maybe shooting a really large documentary, you're burning through cards. It just gives you more, I guess, discretion and more flexibility over your data. So to summarize, if you want the highest quality, like movie-like quality, you want to shoot in XAVC SI in either 4K or HD. And if you're just like, you want to shoot standard, you want to get 200 megabits per second, you want to shoot in XAVC S 4K. And if you've got a powerful Mac computer and you also want more control over how much data your video takes up on your card, you want to shoot in XAVC SHS. Hope that made sense. Like I said, this camera is pretty complicated, so feel free to rewind this tutorial if you need to rewatch that section. All right, so now that we know what frame rate and what file type we're shooting, the most important settings is your color profile. One of the cool things about modern cameras is they allow you to shoot in 10-bit color, which gives you way more color information than electronic cameras have ever been able to capture, and it also allows you to further color grade your videos to make them look more cinematic, more commercial, and just more professional in general. So you want to make sure you pick the right color profile for whatever you're shooting. And if you're a vlogger, I have not forgotten about you. I'm going to show you how to set up your vlog setting so that you get cinematic vlogs. Let's get into it. All right, so to set up your picture profiles, you want to hit the FN button and you will get your quick menu to come up. And from your quick menu, you want to go to the top left corner and pick picture profile. Now you'll see 11 different picture profiles and it's kind of overwhelming, but what you want to do is you want to pick your favorite number and set that picture profile up for you. And once you pick your picture profile, you want to hit right and it will open up a whole bunch of complicated settings, but I'm going to keep it simple for you. So you want to go to gamma and you want to pick S Cinetone and you want to go down to color mode and pick S Cinetone. Again, pretty simple. Now what is S Cinetone? S Cinetone is a Rec. 709 picture profile. Simply put, it is the picture profile that you should use if you're just a casual shooter. You just want your videos to look good out of the camera. You're a YouTuber, you don't want to do any color grading to your video or very little color grading, and you just want a cinematic look. Sony recommends this as just like the built-in film emulation look, and I personally really like it. The downside of it is you don't get as much flexibility with your colors or light data, so if something is too dark, too bright, you'll have less room to play around in. If you want more flexibility, or as I say, maximum flexibility in both your colors and your light data, you want to be shooting in log. So for that, you want to go to gamma again, and you want to go down to S-Log3, and you want to go down to color mode, and here you actually have two separate options. Thank you, Sony, so many options. But you either have S-Gamut 3 Cine or S-Gamut 3. Now, there is a slight difference. S-Gamut 3 is better suited for short films, cinematic color grading, if you're planning on making something look like a movie, but for 90% of people, this is going to be the picture profile you go with just because there's more dynamic range. But if you're someone that's a Sony shooter already, you'll want to go with S-Gamut 3 because most of the cinematic LUTs that are out there, you know, those filters that you just slap on and you get a cool look, are actually made for S-Gamut 3. If you're using LUTs from a few years ago, or if you just have a LUT that you want to use, most likely you want to go with S-Gamut 3 because this is the setting that most LUTs are made for. Now, one of the issues that a lot of you guys will run into when it comes to shooting S-Log is that all of your footage is just going to look milky and white, and it's kind of hard to just like look at while you're recording. So the best thing to do is that you want to go back into menu again, and from menu, you want to go to your first home menu, and right here you'll see assist. More than likely this will be set to auto, but you want to set this to S-Log3. It will basically make it so that you can now look at it the way that it will kind of look like after you add your conversion LUT to color grade S-Log3, you need to take your S-Log3 footage, add a conversion LUT so it looks normal, and this will kind of give you a close approximation of what that looks like. And you also want to go to the setting right next to assist, which is also labeled assist, but you want to go into assist and make sure this is on, because without it, it won't actually add that monitoring LUT. So what if you're a vlogger and you want to get cinematic vlogs? More than likely, you're not happy with the colors you're getting, you don't want to edit your videos later on, or maybe you're not a professional vlogger, but you just want to get cinematic footage while you're traveling, going to music festivals, or just doing adventures. So how do you set it up to look cinematic? Well, it's really easy. There's actually a mode in this camera called Cinematic Vlog Mode. So this is what you normally get with your Sony camera, and the lighting in here does not look good. It looks good for the main camera, but I probably look too pink and magenta right now, but most likely this is what you're getting. But with Cinematic Vlog Mode, you get this. Now this is going to make everything look way more cinematic for two reasons. One, you have the black bars at the top and bottom, and it's also now using S-Cinetone, but it does have other color options. It's going to make your skin look way better. And you can also add a color filter on top of your footage. I'll show you guys right now. This is gold, this is ocean, this is forest, and this is going to help make your footage look even more cinematic. So let me show you exactly how the setting works. So once you go into cinematic vlog mode, you turn it on from right here, you'll see a bunch of options here at the bottom. First one is your color option. From here, you can choose S-Cinetone, clean, chic, fresh, mono, which is black and white. Now, this will really depend on your personal aesthetic and what you as an individual like. I personally really like S-Cinetone, gives you a little bit more room to grade, but for most of you guys who don't want to do any kind of color grading or color editing, you probably want to go with clean. Next to it, you have your color filter. So with that, you can also go into gold, ocean, and forest. It will add a bit of a color filter. And next to that is focus speed. So you can go to high, mid, low. There's no reason to ever shoot in anything but high. It is the best focus setting. Use the best settings. Now, one thing that I don't like about cinematic vlog mode are the black bars at the top and bottom. It doesn't really work if you're not watching things on a TV, and it doesn't really look good on YouTube, and it does not work on Instagram or TikTok. So for that, I actually recommend turning off cinematic vlog mode, and right below that is ST. You've got a bunch of different color filters right down here. Vivid, portrait, standard, a bunch of cool things. So if you want to adjust your colors that way, that's also another option. Okay, so I know I've given you guys a ton of information on how to make your colors look good, how to get the best quality out of your camera, and I hope I'm not overwhelming you guys. But there's one more setting that you have to look at, and without this setting, honestly, you're missing like one huge part of this camera, and that is stabilization. If you're shooting handheld, vlogging, you want your footage to look smooth, and shaky footage always looks bad. So let's talk about how to do that. So you want to go back into your menu system, and right below your main menu, you'll see this little camera icon. You want to go hit right and go all the way to the very, very bottom. And here you'll see image stabilization. And inside of image stabilization, you'll see steady shot. Now, there's a few different modes and they can get a little confusing, but I'm gonna keep it simple. Dynamic active will crop into your sensor just a little bit, and with that, it'll give you silky smooth footage. But for most people that don't have incredibly shaky hands, or you're not running with your camera, active is the way to go. Now, this will still crop into your footage just a little bit, but you won't see too much of a loss in quality. Standard is going to be for people that are cinematic filmmakers that know how to handle a camera for handheld shooting. And off is for people that just don't want any stabilization because they're putting their camera on a gimbal, or for most people, you want to go with active, and active gives you incredibly smooth footage. If you don't turn this setting on, you are really missing out on this camera's features. And one quick side note, this camera also has a mode to give you that blurry background effect that everybody wants. Usually you need an expensive lens to get it, but there's actually a button right here at the top, and if you hit it, it'll do whatever it has to do in camera to give you that blurry background effect. Sometimes it will add it digitally, or sometimes it will open up your lens to a wider aperture to give you that blurry background effect, but it's a really cool feature on this camera, and I highly recommend using it, especially for vloggers and cinematic filmmakers. So if you've been watching the video so far, you probably want to know how to get the best slow motion on this camera. And the answer is a bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it simple. So you want to go to the top of your camera and go to slow in SNQ, which is slow and quick motion. And once you go into menu, go over to this camera icon, hit right, image quality and settings, and then go over to S&Q settings. And from there, click into it and you'll get frame rate settings and record settings. First, you want to go into record settings and you want to pick the highest quality possible. This will make sure that your slow motion doesn't have any reduction in quality, because a lot of cameras will reduce quality when going to slow motion. And then you want to go into frame rate settings. Now you'll see two settings here. It can get a little confusing, but I'll try my best to keep it simple, as I've been doing this entire tutorial. Let me know how I'm doing in the comments. So you'll first see your record frame rate and S&Q frame rate. So your record frame rate is what the camera is going to record your slow motion footage as. So for this, I recommend going to 24, nothing below 24, because then it's going to give you weird choppiness. And then you want to go to 60, which is the highest frame rate. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see 2.5 times slow motion, which means that whatever you record will be 2.5 times slowed down. If you don't want it to be that slow, you can go to 30 and you'll get 1.25. But the thing is, if you go below 24, like I am with 15 frames per second, you'll actually get quick motion where it'll kind of just look like a hyperlapse, or a video is moving really, really fast, almost like a time-lapse video. And this can kind of be used as a time-lapse setting. You could hold this camera, move through a space, shooting at a faster frame rate, and then when you shoot it, you'll kind of get like this speed ramping effect. But if you set up your camera in this way, you'll be able to get slow motion in camera. However, if you're planning on using the slow motion for a commercial, music video, I don't recommend doing it this way. I recommend simply recording 60 frames per second at the highest setting you can and slowing your footage down in post-production. This way you have more flexibility over how slow it is, but you'll also get better video quality overall. So I have one more feature to talk to you guys about, and this is possibly the most exciting thing about this camera, but it's also the most complicated, and very specific people need this. And this is AI auto reframing. So a lot of you guys are shooting your videos, you're moving around a lot, you don't have someone to pan with your camera, you kind of have a wide shot, and you wish someone or something could kind of do zoom in shots, wide shots, all that stuff, right? Wouldn't it be cool if you had a cameraman inside your camera? Well, you kind of have this possible now with auto reframing. So for auto reframing, you want to go back into your menu system, go into the camera icon all the way to the bottom of this menu, and on the right, and go down to auto framing settings. And here you'll see auto framing. You want to turn this on, and you've got a few options here. So framing operation mode, start when tracking, basically refers to if you have someone behind your camera, when they have pressed the shutter button for autofocus, that is when it will start. More than likely, if you're using this setting, you don't have someone behind the camera, so I actually recommend going with auto start, or there's also auto start 15-second switch and auto start's 30-second switch. What this does is you can start talking to the camera, and after about 15 seconds, it will switch to a close-up, switch back to a wide. You can set this to either 15 or 30 seconds. This is a really good way to have variety in your shots. And at the same time, you also have crop level. You can have a large crop, medium crop, or small crop. This is basically how close it gets with the reframing to your face. And then you also have frame tracking. Now, in my testing, it doesn't really make too much of a difference if it's 3, 4, or 5. So I kind of just like to leave it at 4, because I found also at 5, it can sometimes be a little too quick, like a little too jittery. So in terms of quality, I just leave it at 4. And now here's the interesting parts. Movie record streaming. If you're someone that is doing a live stream, what this does, it crops in for your live stream and keeps your recorded footage wide. And then there's also HDMI output, which is much more exciting. What you can actually do is have the camera footage that is recorded in camera be a wide, and have the footage that is recorded out to your external monitor or your external recorder, that can be a crop. So that's kind of a cool setting, and it helps add variety to your shots. Now, this is not a setting that I expect a lot of people to use, but it is a really, really cool feature. And one thing that I have to make sure you guys know about is that if you're going to pick up this camera, shoot with this camera, you want to make sure you get the fastest possible SD cards for it. I'm going to leave links in the description down below for the best pricing on the ZVE1, but also those SD cards. So if you guys are thinking of picking up this camera or those SD cards, make sure to check out the links, description down below. And with that being said, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.